Sarah, welcome back to Waterstones.
Thank you very much.
We're going to be talking about your new novel, Enlightenment, and I'm lucky enough to have spoken to you about this previously, and you were so enthused about the ideas that go into the book and the characters, and in particular about this idea of stargazing.
Mm-hmm.
Your eyes were sort of sparkling, and you've just come back from America where you've been looking at the eclipse. Well,
I have.
maybe
yeah.
not looking at it,
Yeah.
looking at it safely.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about this fascination with stargazing. I wondered whether that already existed and therefore you wrote this book, or whether in the course of writing this book you ended up becoming enthused and fascinated.
Both of those things are true. I've always been very interested in the sky, both at night and during the day. My father was, and still has, a huge interest in astronomy, and when he was a boy and he lived in a quite poor area of London, somebody gave him a book on sports and pastimes for children, and there were instructions for making a telescope. So he had very little money and very few materials, and he made a telescope out of a rolled up magazine and the lens from a broken magnifying glass. And eventually he had a telescope of his own. So I was brought up just about being able to make out Saturn's rings in the back garden and the moons of Jupiter. And my dad's training was in physics, so he used to try to teach me the physics and the optics of it. So I've always had this very great interest. I thought I saw Halley's Comet when I was 6, but I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And then Hale-Bopp, the great comet of Hale-Bopp, came by in 1997. So when I started writing Enlightenment, which would have been 2017 when I began, there was a sort of background hum of the stars. And then the more I tried to write about it, the more I wanted to know more. And I bought myself a telescope just before the pandemic, so February 2020. And technology is so cheap now that I was able to buy the kind of telescope that 20 years ago would have just been observatories. So it's huge, 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope with a GPS system.
Okay.
And then, of course, the pandemic came. And there were clear skies because there was no air travel and no industry.
Yeah.
And we happened to have a very good spring. So as I was thinking about Enlightenment, and as my character in Enlightenment developed an interest in the stars, I was able to go out in the back garden in my city centre house in Norwich and observe nebulae where stars are being born and binary stars. I used a diffraction grating to look at the spectra of different stars, which enables you to see their composition. And so, the two things grew together.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, as you say, to have that kind of technology available to you now that would have been a pipe dream for your dad.
Yeah.
Or probably didn't even exist when your dad was making his telescope.
No, absolutely not. And he came with me to choose the telescope. He went to a tiny little shop in Ely, and he came down with my mum from the Midlands to advise me on this telescope. And he said, a few years ago that would have been £30,000 or £40,000 worth of equipment, and now, you can just have it in your sitting room. Still not very cheap, but it's within reach. And then we left the shop and he started chuckling to himself, and I said, "Why are you laughing?" He went, "Yeah, you'll never use it, it'll always be cloudy." And he was sort of right in that one of the, part of the romance of astronomy is that they're always there. They're, Jupiter and Venus are up now, but it's daytime and it's cloudy, so we can't see them. And so the romance is in waiting for this perfect series of conditions. And when that moment comes, you have to kind of run out and put your woolly coat on and your hat and get ready.
On our way up to this room, you were talking about watching the eclipse in the States, where you said the clearness of the sky is the thing that makes all the difference to the viewing experience there.
Yeah, it was really stressful because the path of the total eclipse on Monday ran all the way from Mexico and Texas right the way up to Canada in this swathe of shadow. And obviously Texas was the best bet for kind of clear skies. But there was a general agreement that I should not be left wandering around Texas on my own. So I went to Vermont, which is not far from New York, and everybody said, Vermont will be cloudy. And I thought, well, it will still go dark, the birds will fall silent, the light will change. And then about a week before it happened, the weather forecast flipped and everybody bolted from Texas and had to make it up north. And what an experience. It's simultaneously literally completely predictable because of the calculations of the orbits. We know to the moment when these things are happening. So it's not at all strange. It's celestial geometry. It's completely predictable and calculable. It's also the maddest thing I've ever seen. And it's quite rare for something to be both. And I think that's what draws me to astronomy. It's sublimely, appallingly beautiful and absolutely ordinary at the same time.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that thought a little bit later, because I realize I could talk to you about the stars forever, but we should talk about the book. But I want you to remember that phrase, and we'll come back to it a bit later. Let's talk a little bit about the characters here, because there are, I suppose, 3 distinct people who really feature heavily in the book, in their orbits around each other. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about each of them. So we'll begin with Thomas. Tell us about Thomas.
Every time I have to talk about Thomas, I develop a silly grin.
Okay.
Because I love him so much. And I'm normally quite cold with my characters and consider them mere plot devices, but Thomas ran away with me. So the novel is set over the course of 30 years, and he begins as a man in his 50s, and he ends as an elderly man at the end of the book. And he was born and raised in an extremely old-fashioned Strip Baptist chapel in Essex, in a small town in Essex. And he divides his life between the chapel pew, where he was born and brought up, and London, where he lives the life of a writer and a gay man and has lovers and so on. And he finds himself with one foot in sea and one on shore, and he can't leave his faith, and he's drawn to God and he's drawn to the pulpit, but he also wants to live his full nature. And he's a writer, and he writes a column for the local newspaper. And one day his editor says, "Get some new material. We're sick of Essex, we're sick of books," and sends him out to look at the moon because there's a comet coming. And Thomas goes out slightly sulkily, never paid any attention to astronomy, and he goes out with a pair of binoculars to look at the moon, and he falls in love. And that's the beginning of a lifetime's interest in astronomy.
He has a very close connection with one of his fellow Baptist church attendees, which is Grace. Tell us a little bit about her.
Thomas, I'm really interested in writing forms of love that are either unexamined or mistrusted. And I liked the idea of writing a kind of cross-generational friendship. And Thomas's closest friend is a child called Grace. And he saw her when she was a tiny baby whose mother had just died, and out of nowhere is sort of thunderstruck by a kind of fatherly love, but also a sense of responsibility to this new soul that is born into this church that has crushed him to a certain extent. And he's kind of a godfather, and they grow up together, and together they grow up and away from the church and through love and through astronomy. And she's I don't know why, she's furious all of the time. She's a little cross, passionate, bustling girl who makes her own clothes and is very eccentric and is constantly torn between the obligations of her church and the fear that she's a sinner and the desire to live a full, rich life of liberty of the mind and of the body. And so she begins the book as a furious teenager, and she ends the book as an equally furious woman of about 40, but changed. They both change through the book.
And the third person, that, as I say, that sort of comes into this orbit, I've just realised that causing a 3-body problem, you could say,
yes, that
just to tie things
very
together.
Deliberate, yeah.
is James. Tell us a little bit about him.
Yes. James is not in the church, so I'm really interested in the ways that outsiders disrupt a contented and an ordinary and a closed life. And James is a man who lives in the local town. He runs the local museum, and he's responsible for a grand dilapidated house that's just behind this chapel. And Thomas sees him one day. No, he sees Thomas one day by mistake. And James is bored. He's one of those people who's just bored and dissatisfied and always looking for something to shake him out of his life. He's married with children. He knows he should be content. And he sees Thomas outside this strange chapel, and he never really forgets this odd-looking man. And then Thomas eventually meets him, and by a mistaken understanding, Thomas falls in love. And he's never really been in love before. And there's this agonising procedure of two people drawn together on the premise of a misunderstanding. And much of the book is to do with the way we orbit each other, the forces that draw us together and drive us apart, and the fact that sometimes you have to succumb to those forces, and what do you do when it takes you in a direction that you would rather it didn't. I'm trying not to do spoilers.
You're doing very well.
Thank you. I nearly did.
As you've sort of hinted there, the book has quite a formal structure, which is based on some of these astronomical ideas. So the book has 3 distinct sections which are connected to celestial events.
Yeah.
Was that always going to be the case when you sat down to write it, or did that emerge as you were writing?
No, that emerged and developed, and it's very unusual for me for a book to take that path. Generally speaking, I have a very clear idea of the form before I begin, and then I write almost to that template. And the book is unrecognisable from its first draft, sort of 5 or 6 years ago, 5 years ago, which was very slender and didn't have an organising principle. And a couple of things happened. My father had been teaching me about the laws of Kepler, which are beautiful. So Kepler, in the 17th century, defined the laws that keep bodies in motion. So there's 3 of them, and they're gorgeous. And I became very interested in that. And then about the same time, I think it was during the pandemic, I was corresponding with a friend who was working as a doctor during the pandemic, and I felt this terrible sense of distance between the life of those of us who were safe and the life of those of us who weren't. And I would be overcome by fear and worry of what would happen to people who were in peril. And I was talking to him and I said, I'm so afraid and so sad. And he said, it'll pass and then it will return. And I thought, that's such an extraordinary form of consolation, because you can tell people that their heartbreak or their fear will pass. It will, but it will return, because that's part of the human condition. And it was like hearing a bell ring, and finally I had the organising principle of the book, which is that I could take Kepler's motion of bodies in orbit with this brutal wisdom that things pass and they return. And so suddenly the idea of orbits became vital to the structure of the book.
And the thing I wanted to return to was this idea that looking at the sky in that way can be both sort of epic because of what we're actually looking at, but very, very ordinary. And what I think you do brilliantly in this book is to have really quite big, grand themes and a sort of this epic scope, but to focus it entirely on these very ordinary people who are dealing with the things that any one of us would be dealing with. Tell me a little bit about balancing those 2 things.
Firstly, I'm delighted that you noticed that, because that was something I tried very hard to do. It's this constant juxtaposition of the sublime and the ridiculous, or the sublime and the ordinary. And I don't think there are any ordinary lives, really. Sometimes when I'm travelling on a bus or going for a walk, and you see this mass of humanity kind of walking towards you, and every single one contains fathoms of an interior life that we will never know and that their loved ones will never know. And I don't think I've ever met anyone who is truly boring. You know, if you ask and if you listen, you discover that everybody is an extraordinary composition of hopes and fears and dreams and incident and coincident, but at the same time really ordinary. Yeah. And so the more I studied astronomy, I would realise that I would go out into the back garden and photograph through the lens of my telescope on my phone Messier 42, the Orion Nebula, a gas cloud where stars are being born. And then I would just go into my little terraced house in Norwich and make a mug of tea. And I wanted to write a book that showed how extraordinary that is. And so it was really necessary to me to write the everyday detail of contemporary Essex. They are not wealthy people, nor are they sort of excitingly dissolute, they are sort of ordinary, but we are part of the universe. So when you go out and you look at a solar eclipse, you're not observing something, you are part of it. So we are part of the universe. And so constantly all through the book, my eye, or the reader's eye, moves from the incomprehensibly sublime, or ideas around quantum mechanics, down to how to make pastry.
For a lot of people, I suppose like myself, who don't have faith, we have that similar idea or feeling can come from looking at these big scientific ideas, or the universe. But you very much tackle faith in this book, and I imagine that's quite a tricky thing to write about without it feeling like it's distancing itself from the reader. Tell me a little bit about why it's such an important theme in the book, and how you handle that.
I think faith is no less important and no more important than every other constituent part of life. And I think novelists do have, to an extent, a kind of ethical duty to grasp and to tackle as many different aspects of life as we can. And so there was a moment when I thought, I don't quite know how to do this in a way that isn't tedious to those people who don't know about particularly this form of faith, or have no faith of their own. Then I thought, but I'm not worrying about people reading it who aren't physicists or who aren't from Essex.
Yeah.
So I think it's vital for readers and writers to simply consider faith or forms of philosophy or forms of thought as just being another thing to write about. And you write about it with wit and interest and grace and doubt, as much as you would do about any other subject. The big challenge for me is that because I had such a deeply religious upbringing, my grasp of what is common knowledge about Reformed theology is a little bit off. And sometimes in drafts I would talk about, I don't know, the doctrine of election or the 5 points of Calvinism, as if everybody knows what that is, and people would have to say, no, like either explain it or take it out. So there was a constant process of double checking exactly where the right level was. But it's not a book that proposes anything, it asks.
With that education that you had, or that sort of upbringing, as you say, that you had, because sometimes science and religion are pitted against each other, but actually I know several people who are scientists, for example, who have very, very deep faith, and vice versa, and it often intrigues me that is the case. Do you have a similar thing? Because you obviously have the fascination with the science, you have the religious upbringing. Do you feel that the two things are connected in a way?
It staggers me that anybody would think that they're not. It's an extremely new phenomenon that people think that faith and science are intractably opposed. We haven't had a secular world for very long. Secularism's really new. The initial great leaps in mathematics were undertaken by Muslim scholars in however many hundreds of years ago. The Enlightenment was driven by a form of post-Reformation Enlightenment faith, proposing that if God was a God of reason and order, and he'd created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, which personally I have my doubts, but if he had done, we would have the capacity to understand the motion of the planets. And so this sounds very rude. It's such an absurd thing to think that it always really staggers me that anybody who's read any books at all thinks that those two things are opposed, but it's just in the modern discourse, I suppose. More than that, the more you study theoretical physics, the more you understand that leaps of faith and the quality of doubt are absolutely intrinsic to this form of study. And I think that some people who have like a kind of passing interest in the sciences think that it is comprised of a series of demonstrable facts. But if you study theoretical physics in any way at all, you soon come to understand that they're extraordinary leaps into the dark, which are then to a certain extent bolstered by calculations, and then a few years later the whole thing gets knocked down and they have to begin again. So Carlo Rovelli, the Italian theoretical physicist, who's my great hero, he talks about the study of physics as being, he calls it a learned rebellion. So you have to learn the state of physics as it is, and then you doubt it and you rebel against it, which is almost like a quality of religious thought, that you understand the orthodoxy, that's what everybody trusts in, that's what they all believe, but is it though? And what's really interesting is that in the early study of theoretical physics, there was an experiment, it was a mathematical experiment really, that demonstrated that energy was dissipated in a different way from conventional wisdom. And they called it the ultraviolet catastrophe. So things being turned upside down in physics, doubt, inquiry, it's all really intrinsic to the process. It's not the same as faith because it's godless, but it is a form of faith in some ways.
That's also an excellent band name, I think. The
Isn't
Ultraviolet
it?
Catastrophe.
I know. Prog rock.
Yeah, definitely.
It's not folk, is it? It's prog rock.
Definitely not. A couple of weeks ago, the author Marion Keyes was sat where you are, and we were talking about her new book, My Favourite Mistake, which is a very different book to yours, but obviously there are weird ways in which books can become connected. It is a book that similarly focuses on quite a small community, and she was speaking about how the character, a woman sort of in late middle age, does an element of looking back on her life and she was talking about appropriate shame. And I suddenly realised when I was thinking about your book that felt very apposite. It felt like a really important phrase. And I wondered whether you could talk a little bit about these characters. Well, we don't want to give anything away, but that in the development of this story, particularly towards the end, after time has passed, there is an element of looking back on actions and the shame that's connected to them.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about writing that, because it's really interesting.
So it's typically wise of the great Marion Keyes to come up with a phrase. I mean, she's amazing, and and I understand what she means. And I've noticed something about contemporary secular discourse, which is this. Bear with me. In the absence of the concept of sin, we also lose the concept of redemption. So necessarily, understandably, in a secular world, we don't talk about sin. But if you do talk about sin and you do talk about having done something wrong, then the corollary has to come round, which is that you have failed, and you know you've failed, and you know you've done something wrong, but there's capacity for redemption, however you find it. You know? And appropriate shame is not a phrase I've ever used, but it's something that rings a bell. And I would think about a sort of like a necessary guilt. You know, we, all of us, every day fail in some way. The standards that we've set ourselves, the standards that society have set ourselves. And rather than insisting that no, we didn't, or retrofitting our moral law to make the thing that you did okay, actually the wisest and the least painful thing to do is to look back and say, I shouldn't have done that. And then to understand that there can be recompense in the way that you act, or in an act of apology, or in the way that you live in the aftermath. And I think I'm no longer religious, I don't attend church regularly, but the ideas of sin and failure and forgiveness are really vital to my work, I think, and also to the way I live. And I do think it's a shame that we've lost the idea that people can say, I really did wrong, forgive me, and that we know that can be the case. Whereas, you know, these days politicians or social media, no one can say they did anything wrong because nobody is ever forgiven. So, we're a bit stuck. But appropriate shame or appropriate guilt, and then some act of grace or redemption afterwards is really precious, I think.
Yeah. Just to finish off, I realised through reading the book that I have been blessed to live at a particular period in history where Halley's Comet has passed, Hale-Bopp passed, there's been a total eclipse in this country that I was able to witness, and I suddenly thought there's been all these things which will not return we'll see how we go.
You might live for Halley. I'm planning on living for Halley.
We'll do what we can. We'll keep taking the supplements. But it's sort of one of those things where you realise, which is a very lucky time to be alive. Even though those things have now passed and we're in a different period now, it made me realise that we should do more to look up and enjoy what is there on offer.
Yeah, I think so. And I'm sorry to return to theological concepts, but I think a lot about the quality of grace. And the idea of grace really is that of an unearned gift, a moment that arrives out of the universe that you didn't earn, you don't deserve it, you didn't ask for it, it has just appeared, and that you meet it with corresponding kind of gratitude and joy. And the world, every day, the most ordinary day, is a catalogue of acts of grace if you're alert to them. And I think if you are able to see that, to go out and notice that Venus has come up and how bright it is in the morning or in the early evening, and think about how extraordinary it is that you have the capacity to see it and to understand what it is, and then it just goes on shining regardless of what you did that day. I think it kind of rouses in you a kind of gratitude that you're here at all, which is an improbable miracle, and that can carry you through to a kind of graciousness to other people. So I think it's good for us all.
I knew this was going to be a good chat. We sort of already had it in a way, but I knew that we'd be able to do it again and it would feel like a whole new conversation. So, Sarah, thank you so much for Enlightenment, and thank you so much for bringing so much to a discussion about it.
Thank you very much.